June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. The sky above the Pacific Ocean was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that exists only in dreams or paintings, stretched taut across the horizon like canvas waiting for history to bleed across it. The air shimmered with heat rising from the waves, and somewhere far below, schools of tuna moved in silver formations, oblivious to the machinery of war grinding above them. On the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, a young Japanese deck crewman named Nakamura wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at the rows of fully fueled dive bombers lined up like obedient children. Their wings gleamed, their bomb loads hung heavy and ready. In 90 minutes, he would be dead, incinerated in a fireball so intense it would melt the steel bones of the ship beneath his feet. But in this moment, at 10:22, he believed, as did every man aboard that carrier, that Japan was invincible. This was the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. These were the same carriers that had humiliated America at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the same pilots who had driven the British Navy from the Indian Ocean, the same ships that had carved a path of destruction from Hawaii to Ceylon. They had never been defeated, not once. Their commanders walked the decks with the quiet confidence of men who had rewritten the rules of naval warfare, who had proven that battleships were dinosaurs and that aircraft carriers were the future. And now, northeast of Midway Atoll, they prepared to deliver another crushing blow to complete what Pearl Harbor had started, yet to break the back of American naval power in the Pacific once and for all. But history has a way of turning on a single moment, a single decision, a single squadron of dive bombers emerging from the sun at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right time, against an enemy caught with its pants down and its deck covered in aviation fuel. What happened in the 90 minutes between 10:22 and 11:52 on June 4th, 1942, was not just a battle. It was a rupture in the fabric of inevitability. It was the moment when the empire of the rising sun collided head-on with American industrial fury, improvisation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. It was the day the sky broke open and swallowed 3 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, along with 320 aircraft and thousands of men who had believed themselves unstoppable. And it was the moment when the entire trajectory of the Pacific War pivoted on the head of a pin. To understand what happened, you must first understand what Japan expected, what they believed, what they had every reason to believe. Since December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military had operated in a state of near euphoria. The attack on Pearl Harbor had exceeded every expectation. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,400 Americans dead, the Pacific Fleet crippled in its own harbor, and in the months that followed, the conquests had come like dominoes falling. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the impregnable fortress that surrendered in a week, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. Japan had seized an empire spanning thousands of miles, rich in oil, rubber, and resources, all within 6 months. The Western powers had been humiliated, their colonial armies shattered, their white supremacy myth punctured by Japanese bayonets and zeros. The pilots of the Kido Butai were not merely skilled, they were the elite of the elite. Veterans with hundreds of combat hours, men who had trained for years in the demanding art of carrier operations. Their Zeros could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. Their torpedo bombers had perfected the shallow water attack that devastated Pearl Harbor. Their dive bomber pilots could drop a 500-pound bomb into a pickle barrel from 10,000 feet. They had earned their arrogance the old-fashioned way, through victory after victory after victory. And so, as Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu steamed toward Midway in early June, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that this operation would succeed. The plan was elegant. Admiral Nagumo's carriers would soften up Midway's defenses with airstrikes. American forces, drawn out by the attack, would be ambushed and destroyed. Japan would seize Midway, establish a forward base, and perhaps even draw out the remaining American carriers for a decisive battle that would end the war in the Pacific. Intelligence suggested the Americans had at most 2 carriers in the area, possibly Enterprise and Hornet. The Japanese had 4. The math was simple. The outcome seemed certain. What the Japanese did not know, what they could not know, was that American cryptanalysts had broken their naval codes. Station HIPO in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had pieced together enough intercepted messages to predict the attack on Midway with stunning accuracy. Admiral Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming. Yet he knew when, he knew where, and he positioned his forces accordingly. Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which by all rights should have been in dry dock for months, were waiting northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon, ready to spring the trap. But even with foreknowledge, even with 3 carriers instead of 2, the Americans were outmatched in almost every measurable way. Their pilots were less experienced, their torpedoes were defective, a scandal that would cost dozens of lives. Their aircraft were slower. The Japanese had every advantage except one: they didn't know the Americans were there. 10:24 a.m., June 4th. The first strike against Midway had already been launched hours earlier. Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers had hit the atoll hard, but not hard enough. Midway's runways were still operational, and its defenses were bloodied but unbowed. And so, aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a decision. His reserve strike force, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships, sat on the hangar decks. But if Midway needed another pounding, he would need to swap out those anti-ship weapons for land attack bombs. It would take time. It would leave his carriers vulnerable. But there were no American carriers nearby. His scouts had found nothing. The ocean was empty. He gave the order: rearm the planes for a second strike on calls. Down in the hangar decks, exhausted ordnance crews began the back-breaking work of removing torpedoes, unstowing bombs, switching payloads. It was dangerous work. Explosives and aviation fuel everywhere. But these men were professionals. They had done this 100 times. And then, at 10:28, a scout plane radioed back a message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood turned to ice. Ships. American ships. But what kind? The radioed report was frustratingly vague. Destroyers? Cruisers? Or, God forbid, carriers? He needed clarification. He needed to know now. Minutes ticked by like hours. The ordnance crews paused, awaiting new orders. Should they continue rearming for Midway or switch back to anti-ship weapons? At 10:45, the scout plane sent an update that confirmed Nagumo's worst nightmare. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier, which meant American planes were probably already on their way. And Nagumo's flight decks were cluttered with returning aircraft from the Midway strike, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. His reserve strike force was stuck in the hangar decks with the wrong weapons. His Zeros, his precious air defense fighters, were flying low-level combat air patrol, having just driven off a series of piecemeal and poorly coordinated American attacks. It was a nightmare scenario. But Nagumo was a professional. He had been in tight spots before. He would recover his Midway strike force first, refuel and rearm them quickly, then launch a massive coordinated counterstrike against the American carrier. It was the correct decision, the logical decision, the decision that any competent admiral would have made. But logic and correctness mean nothing when fate has already loaded the dice against you. 10:20 a.m. And aboard the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was lost. Not metaphorically lost. Literally, genuinely. Where the hell am I lost? He had launched with 37 dive bombers over 2 hours earlier, flying southwest toward the calculated intercept point for the Japanese fleet. But when he arrived, there was nothing. Empty ocean. No ships. No smoke. Nothing. His fuel gauges were dropping into the danger zone. He should turn back. Every rational bone in his body said turn back. But McCluskey was not a man who accepted failure easily. He decided to gamble. He expanded his search pattern, flying northwest, burning fuel he didn't have, looking for something, anything, that would justify this mission. And then he saw it. A single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northeast at full speed, trailing a white wake across the blue water. McCluskey's instincts kicked in. That destroyer had been depth-charging an American submarine, which meant it had broken formation, and now it was racing to catch up, which meant if he followed that wake, he would find the Japanese fleet. He banked his dauntless dive bomber and followed the destroyer's trail. At almost exactly the same moment, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's torpedo squadron, flying obsolete, slow TBD devastators, found the Japanese fleet through sheer determination and navigational skill. Waldron was a half-Sioux warrior from South Dakota, a man who believed in aggression and guts over tactics. His squadron of 15 torpedo bombers came in low and slow, skimming the waves, charging directly at the Japanese carriers without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, yet without any realistic hope of survival. The Zeros fell on them like wolves on sheep. One by one, the devastators were shot out of the sky. Their torpedoes, the few that managed to launch, ran shallow or failed to detonate. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 planes were destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water, hiding under his seat cushion, watching the battle unfold from sea level. It was a slaughter, a suicide mission, a pointless waste of brave men, or so it seemed, because what Waldron's torpedo squadron, and the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown that followed, had done was drag every Zero in the sky down to sea level. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was now flying low, chasing slow-moving torpedo bombers, burning fuel, focusing all their attention on the immediate threat right in front of them. The air above the carriers was empty, undefended, naked. And that's when Wade McCluskey arrived, 10:22 a.m. From 14,000 feet, McCluskey looked down and saw what every dive bomber pilot dreams of. 4 enemy aircraft carriers in a neat formation, their decks packed with aircraft, fuel hoses snaking across the deck, ordnance scattered everywhere, Zeros circling low, no anti-aircraft fire reaching up toward him because no one had spotted him yet. It was perfect. It was impossible. It was a gift from God delivered on a silver platter. He keyed his radio. Attack! The dive bombers tipped over and fell from the sky like angels of death. The dive itself was a controlled plunge into violence. The Dauntless shook and screamed as it accelerated, the wind tearing at the wings, the altimeter unwinding. The carrier growing larger and larger in the bomb sight. At 2,500 feet, release. The 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. The Dauntless pulled up, the G-forces crushing, the world graying out. And below, on the deck of Kagi, a bomb punched through the wooden flight deck and detonated in the hangar deck, where fully fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance waited like kindling. The explosion was catastrophic. A fireball erupted from the hangar deck, blowing out the sides of the ship, sending aircraft cartwheeling into the ocean. Secondary explosions followed, one after another, as bombs cooked off and torpedoes detonated. Within seconds, Kaga was a floating inferno, her steel deck warping and buckling from the heat, her crew trapped below decks, burning alive. 3 minutes later, Akagi, the flagship, the pride of the fleet, took a bomb hit amidships. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded among the reserve aircraft, triggering a chain reaction that turned the hangar deck into a crematorium. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, watched in horror as his ship disintegrated around him. Flames roared up through the elevator shafts. Explosions ripped through the hull. The ship's communications were severed. He was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser, leaving Akagi to die. Soryu was hit by 3 bombs in rapid succession. Her flight deck was torn apart. Her engines died. Her crew abandoned ship, and she drifted, burning, a tomb for over 700 men. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's finest aircraft carriers were reduced to burning wrecks. 320 aircraft, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, scout planes were destroyed, as either on the decks or going down with the ships. Thousands of irreplaceable aircrew, mechanics, ordnance handlers, and sailors were dead or dying. The Kido Butai, the unstoppable force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, had been gutted like a fish. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch a counterattack that severely damaged Yorktown. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu too, and she joined her sisters at the bottom of the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, gone in a single day. The thing the Japanese soldiers expected was not this. They expected to dominate. They expected American forces to crumble, to retreat, to sue for peace. They had been told that Americans were soft, that they lacked the warrior spirit, that they valued comfort over sacrifice. And there was some truth to that. Americans did value comfort, abundance, ease. But what the Japanese High Command failed to understand was that those values were not weaknesses. They were the products of a society so productive, so innovative, so industrially powerful that it could afford comfort and still build a war machine capable of drowning Japan in steel. In the days and weeks after Midway, as the survivors were pulled from the water or returned to Japan with their horrific stories, a quiet realization began to spread through the Japanese military. They had poked a sleeping giant. The Americans they had fought at Midway were not the same Americans from 6 months earlier. These were men who learned, adapted, improvised. McCluskey following a destroyer's wake. Waldron sacrificing his squadron to drag the Zeros down low. It's American codebreakers cracking Japanese communications. American shipyards repairing Yorktown in 3 days, a job that should have taken 3 months. The Japanese had believed their own propaganda. They had believed that spirit could overcome material, that Bushido could defeat industry, that the purity of Japanese culture made them superior to the mongrel democracy across the Pacific. Midway shattered that illusion. It revealed the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. Japan could build 6 fleet carriers. America could build 30. Japan had trained elite pilots for years. America could train thousands in months. Japan fought with the forces it had. America fought with the forces it would have, and those forces were already being built in shipyards and factories across a continent that Japan could never touch. And one image haunted the survivors. It was not the explosions or the fires or the screaming men jumping from burning flight decks. It was something simpler, something more profound. The American pilots shot down during the battle, those who survived, were pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers. They were interrogated, and the Japanese officers, speaking halting English, asked them about their training, their equipment, their morale. And one young American pilot, barely 20 years old, shivering in a borrowed blanket, said something that stuck with his captors. He said, "We'll be back, and there'll be more of us next time." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. A quiet confidence born not from warrior spirit, but from lived experience. Yet this kid, who had probably never left Iowa before the war, knew that America could replace every plane, every ship, every man lost at Midway. He knew it the way you know the sun will rise, because he had seen the factories, he had seen the assembly lines, he had seen the endless rows of aircraft being built, the Liberty ships sliding down the ways, the training bases pumping out pilots by the thousands. The Japanese interrogator wrote about this encounter in his diary. He noted the pilot's calm certainty, and he wrote, "For the first time, I felt afraid." That fear was the sound of the sky breaking. It was the realization that Japan had not merely lost a battle, it had lost the possibility of victory. And because you cannot defeat a nation that can absorb the destruction of an entire carrier group and come back 6 months later with twice as many ships. You cannot outlast an economy that produces more steel in a month than you produce in a year. You cannot match the innovation of a society that treats problem-solving not as a duty, but as a birthright. The recurring symbol of American power at Midway was not a weapon or a piece of technology. It was the radio chatter. Japanese radio discipline was strict, formal, hierarchical. American pilots, by contrast, filled the airwaves with chatter, joking, cursing, coordinating on the fly, improvising tactics in real time. To Japanese ears, it sounded like chaos, like unprofessionalism. But it was actually something more dangerous. It was decentralized decision-making. Yet it was every pilot empowered to think, adapt, and act independently. It was democracy in action, messy and loud and utterly deadly. When McCluskey decided to follow that destroyer's wake, he didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for orders. He made a command decision, gambling his squadron's fuel and his own career on a hunch. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, such initiative would have been unthinkable. Officers followed plans. Deviation was discouraged. But McCluskey's decision, that one improvised gamble, changed the course of history. That was the sound the Japanese heard in their final moments. Not the roar of engines or the whistle of falling bombs, but the crackle of American voices on the radio, coordinating, adapting, winning through 1,000 small decisions made by men trusted to think for themselves. While the epilogue of Midway is written in the ships that came after. In the 18 months following the battle, the United States launched 17 fleet carriers. 17. Japan, in the same period, completed 2. By 1943, American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class carrier every 2 months. American factories were producing 50,000 aircraft a year. American training programs were turning out pilots faster than Japan could shoot them down. But more than the numbers, more than the tonnage and the production figures, what changed after Midway was the psychology. The Japanese military had believed it was destined to win. After Midway, it knew, at some deep, unspoken level, that it was destined to lose. The only question was how long it would take and how much blood would be spilled before the inevitable end. At the 320 aircraft that burned on the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were not just machines. They were symbols. They were the physical manifestation of Japanese naval air power, the tools of a strategy that had seemed invincible. Watching them burn, watching the best pilots in the Imperial Navy go down with their ships, the survivors understood that they were witnessing not just a defeat, but a revelation. The Americans were not soft. They were not decadent. They were not going to quit. They were going to build more ships, train more pilots, refine their tactics, and come back again and again until Japan was crushed under the sheer weight of American production. One Japanese officer, years after the war, reflected on Midway in his memoir. He wrote, "We had been taught that spirit could overcome material, said that purity of purpose could defeat mere numbers, but at Midway, we learned the terrible truth. In modern war, numbers are spirit, production is morale, the factory is the temple, and the assembly line is the prayer. America worshipped at that altar far better than we did." It was not a bitter statement. It was simply an acknowledgement of reality. Japan had fought with courage, skill, and determination, but it had fought against an opponent whose wealth, resources, and industrial capacity were so overwhelming that courage alone was never going to be enough. The sky broke at Midway because the Japanese believed their own mythology. They believed that their victories were proof of inherent superiority rather than the result of surprise, preparation, and an enemy caught off guard. Yet they believed that the Americans would fold after a few hard punches. They believed that history was on their side. And then, in 90 minutes, history proved them wrong. 90 minutes. That's all it took. At 10:22, the Kido Butai was the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, steaming toward another victory. At 11:52, 3 of its 4 carriers were burning wrecks, and the 4th was doomed. 90 minutes. The span of a lunch break, the length of a movie, the time it takes to drive from one town to another. But in those 90 minutes, the trajectory of the war shifted. The myth of Japanese invincibility died. The reality of American power was revealed, and the men who survived, on both sides, carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. The sky broke at Midway, and when it did, it revealed something that had been there all along, hidden behind the smoke and propaganda. The quiet, inexorable force of a free people who refused to surrender, who improvised when plans failed, who trusted their men to think and act, and who possessed the industrial might to turn those qualities into victory. The Japanese expected to win at Midway. They had every reason to expect it. But expectation is not destiny. And on June 4, 1942, in the space of 90 minutes, destiny rewrote itself in fire and blood and falling steel. The day the sky broke was the day the war turned. Everything that came after, Guadalcanal, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was merely the long, bloody confirmation of what became clear in those 90 minutes. Japan could not win. America could not lose. The numbers were too stark, the disparity too great, the outcome too certain. And it all hinged on 5 minutes of dive bombers falling from the sun while the Japanese fighters were distracted at sea level. 5 minutes of American pilots making the shots of their lives. 5 minutes when fortune, preparation, and courage aligned perfectly. The wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu rests on the ocean floor to this day, entombing the men who believed they were invincible. The sky that broke above them has long since healed, but the lesson remains, carved into history like a scar. In war, arrogance is more dangerous than any enemy, and underestimating the resolve of a free people is a fatal mistake. 90 minutes, 3 carriers, 320 planes, 1 battle, and a war that, in that moment, was decided.